Hello, hello.
All right, so this panel is a whim. We don't really know each other.
Oh, come on, a little
a
bit.
little bit. But so let me just tell you quickly how it came about. I wrote a book called The Fifth Risk. I think that was what caught your attention. Sean had a podcast, or has a podcast through Vox, and he was interviewing me, and he was so good. I seldom get that interested in my interviewers, but I got interested in him. And I kind of said, "Where are you?" He says, "I'm in Biloxi, Mississippi." And he was in Biloxi, Mississippi, and worried about the fate of democracy, and I thought that made him unique. So I thought, like, Jesus, he's really interesting. He said, "What's he doing in Biloxi, Mississippi?" Yeah. And I mean, nothing against Biloxi, but we used to go to Waveland when I was a kid, and I don't think a thought ever happened in Waveland. Yeah. And so he was thinking in Biloxi, Mississippi. So I said to Walter Isaacson, we got to have this guy. I didn't even know he had I guess I knew you were about to publish a book, or you just published a book, which is The Paradox of Democracy, which is only part of what we're going to be talking about, but it's part of what we're going to be talking about. So I'm going to be asking questions that sound like I'm asking for your benefit. I'm asking for my benefit, because I actually don't know that much about him, and I'm curious. And I want to start with his wife and child are here, and they'll probably learn some things too about him if I ask the right questions. But I want to do a little biography before we get to your book.
Let's do it.
I mean, I'll frame the question as, like, what you doing in Biloxi? Maybe this is probably the way to start.
I'm proud Coast Trash. I grew up in Biloxi.
You grew up in Biloxi?
Born and raised in Biloxi, Mississippi, and I went to school at LSU, just down the road a little bit. Go Tigers!
Oh, there we go. You went undergraduate.
Yeah, I also got a PhD at LSU.
Okay. In political science.
Political philosophy.
Political philosophy.
Yeah,
all right.
Yeah. I get LSU Tulane. That's not a thing anymore, right? We're all friends now. Is that anyway? Yeah, I lived in Baton Rouge for 10 years. I taught at LSU. I actually taught next door at Loyola for a semester, shortly after I defended my dissertation, and I moved to DC for a few years when I became a journalist, and we had a young son, and decided to move home about 3 years ago, and that is where we are now.
And how do you end up having a podcast for Vox? How's that on?
Well, I mean, Vox hired me to be a writer/long-form interviewer.
Ezra Klein.
Ezra Klein sort of plucked me out of the ether.
What was it about you? Like, how do you find you?
I don't know. You have to ask Ezra that.
Okay. Right.
Well, they were looking for someone to be a long-form interview writer for, I think it was a year or so, and they didn't find the right person. And Ezra was looking for someone who had a different background.
Right.
And of course, I never wanted to be a journalist. I wanted to be a tweed jacket-wearing professor.
Right.
I learned very quickly that nobody is hiring political philosophers in academia, and so I had started freelancing, and I guess a couple of the things I wrote caught Ezra's eye, and he made contact with me, and yada, yada, yada.
So before we move on from Mississippi, or from Biloxi, like, what's it like doing what you do in Biloxi? I mean, it's not dense with people doing what you do.
No one knows what I do, and no one gives a damn. So I just kind of it's like, you know what I mean? I go to the hardware store, I go to Walmart, nobody knows, nobody cares. Total anonymity.
Is it fair to say that you're the person in Biloxi most worried about democracy?
There's a good chance of that. It's not scientific, but there's an 87% chance that is true. I mean, yeah, most people have no idea kind of what I do except friends or family, and they are, of course, the only ones who give me crap constantly about what's going on with politics. But other than that, I just kind of blend in.
All right, so let's talk about this book, because it's a book worrying about the fate of democracy, written well before January 6th.
Yes.
Right. It's before Trump?
Yes.
Okay, so this goes back.
Well, it was conceived before Trump was elected, but we finished writing it well after he was.
Okay, let's just talk about the origins of your book. Like, what gets you jazzed about this subject?
Well, I got invited to Idaho State University to give a talk, and this is about 3 or 4 months, maybe not even that much, before Trump was actually elected. But he was already very much dominating the news cycle. And I gave a whole little spiel about how crazy that was and all the rest of it. And the guy that invited me there was a friend of mine from graduate school, my co-author, Zach Gershberg, who's a media theorist at Idaho State. And after my talk, him and I went out for a long hike, and we got to talking, and he was telling me all these ideas about all these different revolutions in communications and how people talk and learn about the world and how that has changed us across time. And it occurred to me, at every one of those periods of revolution, there was also this consequent political shock, right? And it just sort of...
Give us some examples.
Well, you can start with the rise of sophistry and rhetoric in ancient Greece and Rome, right through the rise of the printing press, which unleashed some of the democratic revolutions of the 18th century, but also gave us devastating religious conflicts that destroyed the continent of Europe. TV, radio, the internet, I mean, these have all upended the way we communicate with each other, the way we learn about the world, and therefore, by extension, it has changed the way we do politics.
Right. And so you're contextualizing what was happening in America now.
Yes.
Right. So what do you think is happening? What did you think was happening in America now when you wrote this? Give us some idea. All right, let's start with what's the paradox?
Well, the paradox is that the very thing on which democracy depends, free expression, is the very thing that can also undermine democracy from within. And this is sort of the pattern that we trace across.
You've seen it over and over and over.
Over and over and over again. I mean, we're seeing it now with the internet, right? It has disrupted our lives. It has disrupted the way we think about the world, the way we learn about the world, the way we process the world. It has changed the way we do politics. It has changed the kind of politicians we are drawn to. And so these links just became clear to me. And coming from the political science world, look, I got a graduate education in political theory, and we never read any media studies really at all. It simply wasn't part of the curriculum. Political scientists like to think about structures and institutions. They like to focus on material conditions, economic conditions, things like that. And that all matters. To be clear, we're super clear about this in the book. We never say, this is the way everyone else thinks about democracy. They're wrong. This is the way to think about democracy. Right. We're just simply saying, this is a really under-theorized way to think about democracy. Democracy, in our estimation, is much more of a culture than anything else. It is a culture rooted in free expression. Right. And that is a very unwieldy thing. Yep. And if you change the way we express ourselves, if you change the way we communicate, it will change the way we do politics. Sometimes for good, sometimes for ill.
If you go back, what sort of triggers your interest? What's the first time when you start thinking, this is a subject worth, there's something going on here that we need to pay attention to?
I think it was the experience of being a journalist and being online all the time and watching how the internet, social media in particular, was not just changing my industry, it was not just changing the way journalists did journalism, the kind of things we covered, it was also changing the public in ways that was affecting the way we did our journalism in turn. And it seemed clear to me that this revolution, the digital revolution, no one really has their arms around it yet. It is such a profound shock to the way we live and think and act. And it just seemed to me that no one really understood that. There was a lot of panic, because there still is. So what we tried to do here was not be super prescriptive. We just tried to step back and go, look, wait a minute, I know things seem really, really, really bad, but it has been much worse before. There's a pattern through history that this sort of slots into.
Tell us a story, from the past. Take one period in history where it's been worse. No. Where we can take
World War II. Anyone heard of it?
But let's take comfort in a disruption in communication, leading to a disruption in governance or in self-governance.
I like to go all the way back to the beginning.
Let's do that.
I like to go back to the Greeks.
Teach me about that for a minute.
It's something that's been interesting to me. Many of you probably know this. There's been a lot of discourse around free speech crisis, right? There's cancel culture and free speech is under attack and yada, yada, yada. That's not entirely wrong, but it's also a very old problem. Plato hated the poets. Plato hated the sophists. Why? Because he thought that they were too persuasive.
Yeah.
Right? He thought that once you unleashed rhetoric, right, and once you opened that up to the public, that people would be easily persuadable.
Right.
That they would be moved to act in ways that were contrary to just government.
Was there a particular poet that really got under his skin, say the Tucker Carlson of his age?
I'm going to go with Aristophanes.
Okay.
It was a famous mocker of
Yep,
Socrates,
yep.
of Plato's teacher.
Yep.
But yeah, I mean, it was just, and again, the Greeks even had, this is something we cover in the book, they had these two terms for free speech, isagoria and parrhesia, right? And isagoria was this idea of the right of everyone to participate in public debate. And parrhesia was the right to speak without limits. Those are not exactly the same thing, and those things those things are constantly going to come into tension with one another, and I think that is what's happening now. People tell me all the time that we're suffering from a deficit of free speech, and I say, no. It's a surplus of speech right now. It has never been easier to participate in the public discourse. The barriers have never been fewer and lower than they are right now, and that has unleashed a lot.
Yes.
And we're struggling to manage it, but it's not an absence of free speech, it is an explosion of free speech, which has unleashed lots of new arguments about what are the barriers, right? Where are the boundaries? What can we say? What can we not say? What are the norms that are driving all of this? I mean, it's all up for grabs now.
Where does the idea come from that there are constraints on free speech that are somehow new and worse? And I think what you say is true. Then why are people complaining about their ability to be heard?
Because I would say for a very long time,
A lot of people weren't heard.
it was the subset of people who were allowed to speak, more importantly, the subset of people who were allowed to be heard was very small,
Yeah.
right? It was a sort of gatekeeping culture,
Yeah.
right? There was a handful of TV networks, a handful of major newspapers, very, very, very few people who are actually allowed to participate in the public debate. That is over now.
Right.
I mean, you can make the case that Joe Rogan, love him or hate him, has more influence than the entire staff at the New York Times right now. There's a case to be made there. That is again, however you feel about that, that's not my point. That is a massive shift,
Yeah.
right? And so suddenly there's a lot of rhetoric and communication and ideas bubbling up from the bottom.
Yep.
And that has been disruptive to people who were not accustomed to being pushed in those ways.
So for the rest of this interview, I'm going to be like the C student who's visiting the professor and trying to get away with the professor not understanding how little he knows. But I want to ask just some dumb questions of you, though. So, and one of them is, like, how do you feel about it? Do you think this is basically a good thing or basically a bad thing?
I think it is a good thing.
You don't miss the gatekeepers.
No, I do not. But I also think it's a very disruptive thing. And I also think we're going through this period of disruption that is very tenuous and very perilous, and I don't know how that's going to shake out. But we're negotiating a lot of things that we weren't negotiating before, and that's messy.
Right.
But ultimately, even in the book, for all the worrying about democracy that we do, we also say it is still the best form of political life without question, because it affords two things: the right to speak and the ability to confront arbitrary and capricious power. Right? Now, what we do with free expression, sometimes you get fascism and sometimes you get liberal democracy, right? But ultimately, I think if we want to be a democracy,
Right.
an actual democracy, not a democracy in name only, not a democracy in which a very small set of elites sort of drive the conversation, control the conversation, set the boundaries, decide what stories a society is telling about itself. I don't think that's democratic.
Right.
Now, that may be more manageable, but if we want to live in a democracy, it means everyone should have the right to speak, and that creates a lot of problems, but ultimately, you want a democracy or not? I do. And we have to negotiate those challenges, but I still think it's worth it.
When you look, a couple questions related to that. When you survey the landscape of democratic institutions, what do you think's working and what's not working?
Nothing.
You don't think
I know. I mean, I obviously I'm kidding a little bit. I mean, this is why I'm so interested in your work.
Yeah.
Because you're so interested in.
Why were you interested in my work? I'm curious
Because this man right here is one of the best nonfiction writers in America. Am I right?
but
That's why. That's why.
But it's so intellectually not respectable what I do.
Okay. What? No. What interested me in your work, apart from the fact that it is just outstanding, is that you're interested in bureaucracy and experts and expertise and trust, right? And how our relationship with those things, right? And I think the problem we have right now is there has been a complete collapse in trust in public institutions.
Explain what, I agree. I mean, surveys show that it's in the air. How do you explain it?
I think the digital revolution is how you explain
So when does it start? When you look back at the history of trust in American institutions, what does it look like?
There was a book that really helped crystallize this for me. It's a book by a man named Martin Gurri, who was a former CIA analyst, a media analyst, a Cuban immigrant. And he wrote a book called The Revolt of the Public.
Right.
And his thesis was basically like his job at the CIA was to just look around the world and monitor media. And what he noticed is right when the internet really takes off, right, in the early aughts, if you looked at a line graph of the amount of information floating in the world,
yep.
It's almost like looking at a line graph of like, positive COVID cases in like February 2020, right? It's just an absolute explosion.
Right.
Right? And his thesis, which I think is right, is that now, because the world is so much more transparent, right? Because there are no gatekeepers, because elites cannot dictate what stories a society is telling about itself, the capacity for centralized power has been greatly diminished.
Yep.
Greatly diminished, for better or worse. But that happens once the barriers to information were annihilated, which they were, and that really happens with the internet, and that was a complete game changer. So now, I mean, does anyone think that the elites, or the people who run our institutions, are any dumber or more corrupt or more incompetent than they were 50 years ago or 100 years ago or whenever? I don't think so. We can just see more now, right? We have access now in a way we did not before, and that is a change to which people in power have not adapted.
Right.
And they're still sort of clinging to the world that has already died.
Huh.
And I think we're in this kind of interregnum that's really uncomfortable for lots of people.
But you're laying the blame at the feet of the people who are in power, not adapting to the new situation.
Some of the blame, sure.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, I think you could also lay the blame at the feet of the people who are mistrustful, like not realizing, not being able to handle the truth.
Yeah.
That it's that not appreciating that the people they're evaluating are human beings too, and they happen to know more about them, and they need to sort of adjust the way they evaluate them.
Maybe, I mean, maybe this is part of just, my roots and where I come from in the South, a working class family, in a small town. I really find myself resisting this temptation to blame the public. I mean, I think it's actually more true. I think our democracy has failed the public much more than the public has failed our democracy.
The democracy is the public.
It is. But I think the experience that people have now is the experience of feeling like this is something I've written about. It's this simultaneous combination of knowing about everything that's going wrong in the world, not just in your neighborhood, but in Bangkok and Beirut and everywhere else, and also this feeling of complete impotence in the face of it.
Right.
We are not wired to know everything about everyone all the time.
Yeah.
And our system, because it's so sprawling and so big and so much of our life is mediated, we actually don't have many opportunities to participate meaningfully in public life, right? I don't think we've done enough, we don't educate people well enough, our healthcare is garbage, right? And I think there's this experience of cynicism and discontent that unfortunately I think can manifest itself in really unproductive ways. Right. And I think that's where we are.
Yeah. So what do you do about it?
I don't know. I don't know.
I thought you were going to fix it for us.
Someone smarter in this room can tell us how to do it. I really do not know. I mean, I don't even pretend to have those sorts of answers. I mean, again,
this is depressing.
Am I not supposed to say that? Am I supposed to?
No,
Look, when we were writing
have a 5-point plan that we can all discuss.
No,
but at least you have it.
No, our editor and our publisher, when we're writing this book, that's what he wanted. Like, no, don't you get it? What I need is a final chapter with your 15-point
a tragedy with a happy ending
plan to save democracy. You want me to just crap that out, even lie? I mean, I don't have it. The best, all I can say is that it has been worse before. We've been through these sorts of disruptions before. I mean, what we're experiencing is somewhat unique in that we didn't have the internet 100 years ago. But fundamentally, it's the same sort of dynamic, and I think we'll come out on the other side of it, but.
Try again on this question, which you kind of just ignored when I asked it. And the question is, no, not that question, this question. What's working and what's not? When you look at what the relative strengths in the democracy are, maybe they're not working quite as well as they used to, but they're relatively strong. What institutions pop to mind?
Can I do the thing I'm not supposed to do because I'm also an interviewer? Can I flip that to you? I mean, since you're someone who writes about bureaucracy and
I don't really, it's funny you say I read about
I mean, I'm serious.
I wrote this thing. I'm going to put away our, I'm just going to, because I'm going to start talking. So what I did is I thought we hit a kind of bottom in the Trump transition that I thought, for me, it was a literary opportunity. Donald Trump, I'm so grateful to him. I felt like if I could keep him around forever, I would. He just generates material. And for me, the way he generated material was he didn't show up for his transition. And we have this, this process, which is like fundamental to democracy, the transition of power. And we have rules about it, laws about it. And the outgoing administration is meant to prepare for the briefs across the federal government, the gazillions of agencies that no one knows anything about, and for the incoming administration so that they can hit the ground running. And Obama had been so grateful to George Bush he had taken over in a period of crisis, right? The wars, and the financial crisis and all the rest, for just how good the Bush people were and how easy it was for someone in Obama's Department of Agriculture to roll in and find out what was going on. And so Obama had put all this effort, and Obama's, of course, he's a little bit of a pinhead, right? He's like an egghead. He's just he's an academic. And he wanted these things to be it was the best course, what they prepared was the best course ever prepared on the federal government, across the government. And I mean, as a citizen, I hated it, but as a writer, I loved it, that Trump had, because he was required to, he had this transition team of 1,000 people or whatever who was supposed to roll in the day after the election and learn about all this stuff. But the day after the election, he fired them all and told Chris Christie that, don't worry about that, you and I can learn everything we need to know about the federal government in an hour. And of course, this opens up an opportunity. And it wasn't something that I was inherently curious about. I didn't really care what went on inside the Department of Energy. But now he made me care. If even the guy who's supposed to be running it doesn't care about these institutions anymore, it's time for me as a citizen to start paying attention. That was my hook. And it was totally fun, right? I'm supposed to be talking to you. You're supposed to be talking. I'm supposed to listen. But let me just go on a little bit longer about this.
We're going rogue.
No.
We're totally going rogue here.
And we're also going to open up to questions because this is a democracy.
Yes.
And I didn't know. I didn't have any. I didn't have any sort of sense of what I was going to find when I went into the most boring parts of the government. I thought maybe I'll just find boring things. There won't be anything to write about. And two, I didn't think, well, if it interests me, it's going to interest everybody else. And that's the easiest bestseller I ever wrote. There was low-hanging fruit everywhere. It was basically 4 magazine pieces. The first one was on, and I wrote 3 of them for Vanity Fair. And this is like market testing, how interested people are if the information is presented in a certain way in their government. Yeah. The first piece in Vanity Fair is about the Department of Energy. I was told, this might have been an exaggeration, but it was close to true, that a month after it had come out, it had been the most read thing in the history of the Vanity Fair website. That people were so interested now in what the hell was going on inside their government that you could generate, the book was okay. It wasn't that good, It was, the pieces were good, but they weren't that good. It was that there's this hunger, and it's basically a hunger for a civics lesson. And it's a hunger for an understanding that's not being provided, and the hunger for a defense of what these institutions do. Because, the easy thing to say is it's all bullshit, it's all waste, it's all, they're all lazy bureaucrats. When you meet some of these people who are lifetime civil servants, it is shocking the level of commitment the level of the passion,
Yep.
the interest level. I mean, often it's very in the weeds, like they're experts and they're interested in what they're interested in and nothing. They don't see the context. But I was in awe of them. And these are people who don't care about, they could all be making more money, the ones I was writing, outside of the federal government, who love their country. Many of them first-generation Americans, and they realize the importance of these institutions, and that's why they're there in the first place, doing things that are going to save all our lives. And the fact that this was being treated with the kind of dismissiveness I mean, even the Democratic administrations come in and they're kind of like, they're not that interested. They're interested in the politics, not so much in the government. The government is riveting, and we don't understand it anymore. And it's going to kill us. It really is going to kill. It almost just did, right?
Almost just did.
I mean, COVID could have been 10 times more lethal, and we wouldn't have done any better, I don't think.
Well, this is part of the, I mean, the government in a lot of ways has a kind of public relations problem.
That's right.
Where when things are going well, nobody notices it, right? You have these nameless, faceless bureaucrats that you profile in your podcast and in some of your work that are just extraordinary servants of our democracy and of our public life, but no one knows who they are. The face of the government are these clowns in Congress, like Ted Cruz or whatever the hell.
Yeah.
Pick your clown, right?
Yeah.
And that's the face of
It's
our
a huge
government.
problem.
And that's the worst of our government. That's the
Right.
part of the government that absolutely does
No,
not
it's not
work.
like if the corporation, instead of their CEO getting up in front, it was like the guy who was running the beer pong.
Right.
That's what you get that.
Yep.
And in addition, like you start to compare public and private sector, the way we operate in this country. We treat these public sector people so awfully.
Yep.
The only time you pay attention, you're right, is when something goes wrong, and then someone is pilloried for what went wrong. You never hear about what went right. Who could run a company if all you did was punish people for what they got wrong? Who would take any risk whatsoever? There's no upside. No company could succeed like that.
Nope.
We've got basic structural problems in the way we run ourselves, and it's our fault. My point is, it's not like their fault. It's not like the handful of people we elected to represent us. It's not as simple as that. It's actually a problem in the citizen. It's at our level that we need to all pay attention, and we all need to sort of push in a direction.
Yeah.
And that's where I came to with it. But I found, I gotta say, I was just shocked by the quality of the material, the quality of the characters. A good character is someone who is obsessed with something. And these people were obsessed with their jobs. And I felt so badly for how I thought of them the previous half century. They were just different from how I thought.
Yeah.
We're very shortly going to open this up to questions, but a couple of things I'm curious about. So you went from being an academic to being a journalist.
Right.
What don't the academics understand that they should understand, and what don't the journalists understand that they should understand? Like, is there a two-culture problem?
We don't have enough time, Michael.
No.
No, I mean, I think I made the point earlier about my education in political science and what I thought was missing from that. I mean, something I found really irksome is, especially when Trump was elected, there was a lot of discourse around the end of truth. It's like the death of truth. We're in the post-truth world, and this goes back to an argument we make in the book, right? That I think what people fail to understand is that truth is very much a function of authority, right? We take certain things as true with which we have almost no direct experience or direct contact. We simply trust the authorities when they tell us such and such is such and such. And when that trust goes away, now you got a problem.
Yeah.
Right? And I think part of what has happened again with the gatekeeping culture going away and this just tsunami, I was going to say wave, but really a tsunami of information, some of it good, most of it bad, just sort of flooding and overwhelming us in ways that I think have short-circuited how we do politics. Really.
Right. So let me put a question another way. So I give you the job of educating a citizen. Picking any random person in this room, any random person off the street. What's your advice to them on how to be a good citizen?
My advice would be to cultivate your own intellectual self-defense system.
There you go.
As it were.
How do you do that?
Well, I think something we talk about in the book, you hear a lot of people talking about, well, we need more civics education, right? And I'm not anti-civics education. Yes, teach people how bills become laws. Great.
No. Or what these people are doing inside their government.
But yes, all of that. But I think precisely because we are now overwhelmed, I think, with so much information and so many persuasive actors pushing us and pulling us and twisting us in every direction, I think it is what we advocate for in the book is educating people in rhetoric and persuasion and how these different tools
To evaluate what's coming at them.
Yes, to try to understand how the tools we're using to communicate and learning about the world are changing us and disciplining us and imposing their own logics and their own biases on us. And to be aware of that is at least to be more capable of realizing when you're being manipulated and how, and maybe being more likely to resist it. You know, I mean, again, this is not a great answer.
Not a bad answer.
We don't.
Are there any tricks?
Again,
is there anything I can use, take home and use? I mean, what should I be? What would you tell me to be especially wary of these days?
I would tell you to stay the hell offline.
There
Stay
you
off
go.
Twitter.
Yeah.
Just
Twitter. It's amazing how Twitter.
get off of it.
Yeah.
Just get off of it. Again, I don't. Marshall McLuhan had this line about the global village.
Yeah.
Right. People think that he was trying to make some argument about how it's going to be great, how we're all going to be sort of connected in the age of the internet. And his point was like precisely the opposite. No. Everyone is. Our nervous system is almost going to be connected to everything going on in the world at the same time. That is way too much for an individual to process. Right. It's the point I was making about being confronted with too much information and being impotent in the face of it. So step back, consume information judiciously, and find ways to not do what political media wants you to do, which is approach politics like it's a game, like it's a very nationalized game, right? Red team, blue team. Consume information judiciously, get involved more locally, right? To the extent that our political life is more directly connected to our actual lived experience, that is a better way to do politics. What we have now, when you're watching cable news and you're online, it's very abstract. Right? It's too mediated, and there's just nothing good that comes from that. I shouldn't say nothing, but mostly not good.
What do you consume? Where do you get your information?
You know, it's funny. When I first started in this business, I was reading everything, all the politics stuff. I was watching cable news on all the time, and I cut my news diet at least in half, I would say, in the last year or so. I just simply, like I'll read the New York Times. You know what I mean? I do a podcast. I'm usually talking to people who are involved in public life, and I focus on that. But what I don't do is just get online every day and go on Twitter. I don't go to Politico and then go to Vox and then go to the Times and then go to CNN. I just step way back. You don't need to know everything all the time.
Right.
You can't do anything with that.
Right.
You just can't do anything with that, and it induces this experience of discontent that is not healthy.
Right.
And so I really do think stepping back a little bit and being more thoughtful about how you engage is a good place to start.
Right. So this is, on the one hand, it is a democracy. We want to hear from everybody.
Yes.
On the other hand, this is exactly the sort of panel that invites exactly the worst sort of, someone's going to get up and do something here, but I'd love to open it up for questions.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so why don't we do that? I'd love to hear what people would like to talk about.
I don't know who's supposed to, am I supposed to, I don't know is somebody going to, I guess you just come up to the mic? Or?
Thank you. My question is, how do you feel about the ability of journalists with the largest megaphones to skew? Could you speak to how they skew the message?
Whose message? I'm sorry, I don't quite understand.
Whatever the message is. A journalist has a big megaphone, and they're in politics. They twist and turn the message. Can you speak to that?
My feeling is that journalists actually just simply don't have as much influence as we think we do, or certainly not as much as we once did. Again, because the information space is so fragmented, right? People are not watching the handful of networks. They're sorry, it's the second time I've done that. In the digital age, people know where to go to get the view of the world they want beamed back at them, and that's where they go. So what happens with a lot of journalists is they become captured by their audiences, right? And I think that's one of the reasons why I hardly tweet anymore. I'm trying to quit it entirely, but I can't quite do it.
Because you feel constrained about what you can say because you know how your audience is.
Yeah, it's a lot of groupthink. Twitter becomes the default assignment editor for journalists. I mean, So in terms of the ability of journalists to skew messages, I don't really think we have that power, really, for the most part. A lot of us are just sort of talking to each other in lots of ways. But I think people overstate the influence of any individual journalist. Again, I think someone like Joe Rogan has more influence than every writer at the New York Times.
But Joe Rogan is a kind of journalist.
He is certainly. I mean, what is even a journalist anymore?
Right.
You know, again, I think it's a completely different information space now.
Right.
You know, I don't know if that answered your question.
I think unsatisfactory.
Yeah.
But that's all right.
That won't be the first one, I
You
promise.
didn't give him what he wanted there, I don't think.
That's all right. I did my best.
There's been a lot of use of the word of democracy.
Yeah.
And to me, it seems that democracy is the protection of the minority. But unfortunately, I believe that that only happens by using elections. Only by changing the minority into the majority occasionally, assuming they're honest elections, that's the only way we can do it. We can't change the Supreme Court, or we can't change the government. Yeah, we can if we have honest elections. Does that make sense?
It does, but I would push a little
Sure.
bit on a point you made. I mean, you said something to the effect of democracy being about protecting the minority. I'm not sure that's true. I think certainly liberal democracy is. Democracy produced Nazism, right? I mean,
It did, absolutely.
That's sort of my point. Democracy is mass politics, right? And that can, sometimes you get whatever you want to call Hungary today, and sometimes you get a liberal democracy. Liberal democracy is about the protection of minority rights, of which I'm a strong supporter. But once you open up society, there's no. What I say in the book is that liberal democracy is one of the many exits along the democratic highway. There are other exits, some of them not so great.
Well, if you say that, what's the protection? I mean, if the election goes the wrong way, how do you protect against that? Do you have, where's the government? Where's the military? Where do you go? I absolutely agree with what you say.
Yeah.
And I'll stop talking, I apologize. But if you're right, which you are, how do you protect, how do you create liberal democracy? If you want to protect the minority, to make them the majority.
No, look, the only answer I have to that, and I don't know how satisfying it is that what you're talking about is liberal democracy. And liberal democracy, in my reading, is essentially a culture of norms that you paper over a democratic society that steers it in the right direction. And the only guarantee against that is people organizing and persuading enough of your fellow citizens to vote in the direction that will guarantee those rights, right? But there's nothing in the fabric of democracy, there's nothing in the nature of the political cosmos that guarantees that democracy won't vote itself out of existence. It has happened before, will happen again. There is no guarantee against that. All you can do is persuade the person next to you, and they can persuade the person next to them to protect it. But if they fail to do that, nothing's guaranteed.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Hi. I was wondering, among like the mosaic of tools that democracies have to, or that the citizens in a democracy have to improve our standing and then improve the power of democracy, things like social movements. In the U.S., we have like a free market capitalism, so like the capital markets, for free press. What tools do you think in our modern society with an explosion of technology will be most useful in finding the solution to strengthen our democracy going forward?
Really good question.
That's a great question. I'm almost curious what your answer is too. I mean, a point we try to make in the book is that all of these tools, social media, the internet, they're not good or bad,
Right.
but neither are they neutral. Right? Any tool is as good or bad as the person wielding it. Right? The very tools that are being used to undermine and fragment and separate and polarize could also, in principle, be used to do the opposite. I don't know how to make that happen, right? But the potential is there. Again, democracy provides the space and the potential for these things, but that's all they provide. Ultimately, it comes down to the citizens, pushing that boulder up the hill. But yeah, I know you probably have.
No, I don't have actually. That's kind of what I would have said too. That,
It's a good question.
related to this, it's sort of like trust really is at the center of this conversation.
100%.
How trust gets restored once it's lost.
I don't think anyone wants to hear my answer.
It's a different place you're in. When
I don't know. That's a very tough thing. The ability in a, again, post-gatekeeping world,
Right.
there was never quite an ability to compel consensus. But again, because of the boundaries, there was an ability to sort of manage
Right.
the stories that society was telling about itself, and that is now gone. And because of that fragmentation, I don't know. I don't know.
Is it a one-way? Is it all one direction? And if you look back at the history of trust in American institutions, can you think of periods or any democratic institutions in any society where trust that has been lost is regained?
I don't know. I mean, you can find these periods like in say mid 20th century or so when maybe America was less polarized than it was now, but there was a price for that. Right?
Right.
Lots of people in this country were excluded
Right.
from our political life. Right? Like the price of that consensus was a lot of injustice. Right? And that had to be wiped away. And now it's a much broader, more open game.
So when I was writing the fifth risk, I was asking myself this question, and it was like, how do you get people to trust in these institutions again?
So,
And my answer was, at the time, serious existential external threat that causes a society to have to defend itself together against something outside it. And I actually thought a pandemic would do it.
nope.
Nope, didn't do it.
No.
And so, how many people have to die?
I'll say this. God, I hate to end on.
We got 2 minutes. No, we can. No,
Okay.
no, that's how your book works, though.
But
it's a downer at the end,
The
right? So we don't want to violate the spirit of the book.
Thank you, Michael.
All right.
The pandemic was a real game changer for me. At this point, I don't even think an alien invasion
Well, maybe.
would unite. I don't know, because again, people would go online and there'd be all these competing narratives about what the hell they are and who's responsible. It's a George Soros funded operation or like whatever that, I just don't know. I think, again, this is why I always just get the hell offline, right? Because the problem with these algorithms is that they know what we like, and what we like is spectacle and outrage, and they feed it to us and they feed it to us, and it pushes us apart. And to the extent that is what's mediating our experience of the world, that is a real challenge, because that's all monetized, and it's tough.
We probably have time for one more question.
I'm sorry, I'm talking too much.
We either have time for 2 questions or 1 statement.
My question is basically about how you were talking about how kind of the public exposure to corruption within the highest organizations has increased over the last 50 or so years. How would you say that, would you consider organizations and events such as Project Veritas and Twitter Files to help democracy, or do they do more harm than good?
That's a good question.
It's a very smart audience. I expect no less at Tulane. I don't think there's a yes or no answer to that. Look, a lot of people in my profession were not happy with the Twitter Files saying. I'm not among them. I'm all about more transparency. Again, the problem is that when all of these things get dumped into the public, they immediately get slotted, or they run through the filter of our kind of political, tribalistic mindset. And it's like, once it emerges on the other side of that, we end up right where we were when we started.
Right.
And so what value is the information at that point, right? And that's the problem, right? The tribalism is not just political, it's epistemological at this point, and that's a challenge.
So, 45 minutes with you, I don't know if I feel better and more hopeful about the future of democracy, but I feel better and more hopeful about the future of Biloxi, Mississippi. Sean Illings, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Nice to